Welcome to Ask a Property Manager, episode number 119. Have you ever heard of a group of tenants coming together to buy the building that they live in from the landlord? We're taking a look at just how that's possible today. Stay tuned. So today we're covering an interesting story out of New York City where a group of tenants were able to come together and purchase a multifamily property from their landlord, and it's going to help them to stabilize their lives quite a bit. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the article here. It's a little bit longer. This one is via the New York Times from Yahoo News. A landlord underestimated his tenants. Now they could own the building. We'll go ahead and jump right in here. On a sunny, bright afternoon in 2017, a dozen tenants from a small Bronx apartment building met at a trendy Port Morris neighborhood bar with exposed brick walls, craft beer, and funny cocktails. One of the tenants had slipped flyers under her neighbor's doors a few days earlier, calling for the weekend meeting. Shoving two high-top tables together and ordering sliders and wings, they huddled, trying to figure out how to deal with a new landlord who'd come in with big plans to raise rents after buying the building for $4 million. The group took the first step in a 5-year journey that would end with the landlord gone and the tenants poised to own their own 21-unit building. A nonprofit organization paid the landlord $2.6 million for the property in February and plans to eventually hand it over to the tenants, who will then be able to buy their apartments for $2,500 each. Over the past 5 years, only 11 rental buildings have converted to this type of limited equity co-op called a Housing Development Fund Corporation, where tenants buy their apartments at prices set by the city and can sell them for a limited profit. In this case, the tenants made the deal happen without any funding from New York City, which is an even rarer victory. There are roughly 1,100 HDFC co-ops in the city, mostly converted decades ago, according to the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. That's out of about 7,100 co-ops citywide, according to Aerial Property Advisors, a commercial real estate brokerage. On the cusp of becoming homeowners, the tenants' feat comes at a time when rents are spiraling and speculative development is rampant in South Bronx neighborhoods like Port Morris. They navigated a long and complicated legal case, staving off multiple attempts by the landlord to evict them. Usually a successful tenant association is a homogeneous group led by neighbors from similar backgrounds. The tenants of 700 East 134th are a motley crew, a recipe that often splinters under pressure. A few tenants were formerly homeless, others were unemployed. Those with jobs, a chef, photographer, nurse, metal fabricator, substitute teacher, and a digital printer among them had steady yet modest incomes, but they shared common ground in the struggle against high rents. Some tenants described the landlord, James Giddings, as polite and a good steward of the building. Also a commercial building owner, Giddings, 56, said in an email that his expenses outpaced the rents that he could collect. Some tenants did not pay their rent at all. He also said that he was up against high property taxes and a slow-moving legal system. As inflation has spiked in recent months, landlords have faced rising expenses for labor, fuel, and maintenance. In the end, Giddings said selling the building was the best outcome. I'm happy for the tenants, soon-to-be owners, and wish them success, he said in an email. The landlord underestimated our ability to communicate with one another, which was his biggest downfall, said Kevin Stone, 54, one of the tenants. People will look at us, they'll look at this building in the Bronx, and they'll just think, oh, these are just mediocre people. But people in that building, they have full-time jobs, they're professionals, and they work. We have the ability to think on our own, and we have the ability to write. We can rely on our own wits and our own knowledge to get things done, which we did. Despite an uncertain outcome and some internal conflicts, they held together a potential roadmap for tenants for other buildings to become homeowners. I look at it as generational wealth because I don't have a family yet. One day when I do, this is something I can pass down to them, said Claudia Waterton, another tenant. It's something that no one can take away. You can always come back to this one spot and say, I did this, I accomplished something. At the Bronx Tavern in 2017, the goal was not ownership, it was survival. Over drinks, beers, cocktails, and waters, the neighbors compared notes. Tenants paid around $1,100 a month for studio apartments. They all had variations of the same conversation with Giddings, who would come knocking on their doors to tell them to prepare for rent hikes of $400, $500, $1,000. We all knew that it was a sink or swim situation. It was either come together collectively as a group or be screwed over. One of the tenants at the first meeting told her neighbors that she had learned in a housing court case with the previous landlord that their apartments might be rent stabilized, which would give them vast protections even if their leases didn't say so. The tenants started offering up their skills. One said he was a good writer, another a photographer, offered to document signs of disrepair in the building. A few said that they could visit city and state government offices to gather information. Someone else had a friend at a state housing agency and could make some calls. We were so, I don't want to say clueless, but we didn't know what we were doing. We were just faking it until we made it, said Waterton, whose knack for research and administrative tasks ultimately played a pivotal role in the group's ability to stay organized. That first meeting also exposed potential rifts. One of the tenants pulled Waterton, 41, aside and expressed discomfort about meeting at the tavern. Not everyone had the disposable income to split the bill or felt comfortable saying so. So the meetings moved away from the restaurant to ground zero. They crammed into one another's studio apartments and strategized. Their 5-story brick building of loft-like studio apartments sits on a sleepy block in the shallow of Bruckner Expressway with clapboard row houses on one side and warehouses on the other. The South Bronx had become a darling of developers with deep pockets and big plans for one of the poorest corners of the city. Properties were being plucked up and trendy shops and restaurants were opening in the area as groundwork was being laid for a massive development along the Port Morris waterfront. First, the tenants had to respond to Giddings' claim to the state that the building had been substantially renovated a decade earlier. If he could prove his case, the building would no longer be rent stabilized and he could charge the tenants whatever he wanted or simply not renew their leases. While Giddings offered one of his tenants, Cortland Hankins, a side deal, promising a favorable lease in exchange for dropping out of the fight, he took Waterton to housing court. A lot of us didn't know what harassment meant or what intimidation meant, Waterton said, who works for a printing company. We didn't realize that some of the stuff that was happening were tactics to get us to leave. Giddings denied badgering tenants. The current tenants could not support the expenses, the current rents could not support the expenses, let alone generate any return on the investment. He said, any suggestion that any tenant was harassed is news to me. We do not harass. In the summer of 2017, a tenant organizer, Anna Burnham, contacted the group. She thought it had a chance to take over the building because the tenant association was organized and Giddings did not have a deep financial portfolio of residential properties. If we get on this guy enough, if we do that, I feel that there's a threshold where he's going to want to walk away, Burnham said. But for all its organization, she could see cracks in the coalition. The stakes were different for different tenants. Some tenants were fighting for their lives a lot more than others. She said, if you're a working professional, you're probably not in arrears. You might not emphasize or understand why someone of a lower income is in arrears and would have a different perspective. Lizette Conception moved into the building in 2010, arriving postpartum from a homeless shelter. Getting sued her for unpaid rent. However, he changed his address repeatedly, making it impossible for her to get the housing subsidy to him, according to her lawyer at the time, Jean Lee. She estimates that she owed $20,000 in back rent, and some of those arrears could have been lessened if her housing subsidies had been received. She's still anxious about housing instability because she cannot work and receives public assistance for her disability. She and her son have chronic asthma. It was frustrating. It was emotionally a roller coaster, she said. I thank God that I'm still here. There are days when I feel, how much longer can I be in this apartment? She felt powerless, but tenants with low-paying jobs and those like her who relied on public assistance were the group's biggest strength. The group would not have qualified for free legal aid that was critical to its victory, said Hankins, 51, who was out of work at the time Giddings first acquired the building and was one of the tenants whose low income was enough to qualify for the aid. He's now a housing advocate for people experiencing homelessness, but Hankins was initially doubtful that the group would get very far, and he was incredulous when Stone, who works in banking, suggested that they buy the building, after he and Waterton attended a gentrification conference with a session on homeownership in March 2017. We looked at him like he had two heads, said Hankins, recalling how he and other tenants had dismissed the idea. Although incomes varied among tenants, most of them are Black and Latino, and they share an understanding of the long history of redlining and housing disenfranchisement in Black communities. Ownership felt elusive and unimaginable. We're also almost conditioned not to see the bigger picture, not to believe the bigger picture, like homeownership is not for us, Hankins said, sitting in his fifth-floor apartment on a recent March afternoon. We're not used to being in a position of empowerment. Waterton tapped into another history. An immigrant of Guyana, she moved with her family into a Brooklyn apartment building that her grandfather owned and served as a way station for other relatives. That was a safe haven for us, she said. When this whole thing came up that we could buy the building, I was like, oh my God, this is full circle. In 2019, Burnham introduced the tenants to the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, a nonprofit that supports HDFCs and also helps convert them. After the board explained how ownership is possible, we will win became something of a mantra for the tenants. Some paid for supplies like a computer software program for project management, printing and mailing costs, and food and drinks for the meetings. Watterson said she gave up weekends with friends and family functions. Giddings initially was uninterested in selling the building to the tenants, but then when the pandemic hit and the metrics changed, the story changed. The courts closed, stalling any housing court cases Gideon had against tenants, and the case with the state over whether the building was regulated or not was delayed for over a year. Other potential buyers were also not interested in buying in a building tied up in litigation, and changes made in 2019 to state rent laws meant that if the building was rent stabilized, the apartments would almost certainly remain so even if tenants moved out. In an email, Giddings described a situation that was frustrating and ultimately financially unfeasible. Giddings is the property owner. The tenants were well organized and had great representation. Giddings wanted the tenants to withdraw their challenge to his claim to deregulate the building. In exchange, he would give the tenants leases that followed rent stabilization guidelines, but some tenants worried that a new landlord could buy the building and not honor the agreements. But where would the tenants get the money to buy the building? Normally, HDFCs are financed with public funds, but in 2020, the city had limited staffing, a backlog of projects, and had paused its loan program because of uncertain market conditions caused by the pandemic and changes to the rent laws. In addition, the Urban Homesteading Alliance Board took a low-interest bridge loan from one of its donors, the first time the nonprofit had used solely private funds to pay for such a deal, and will refinance the loan when it turns the building over to the tenants. They finally struck a deal. UHAB came in with by far the highest bid and provided solid guarantees, Giddings said in an email. It took them some time, but they eventually got their act together and closed. The path to ownership is not quite done yet. At least 80% of the tenants must take 12 hours of training with the board to learn how to own, manage, and operate a co-op. Yet another step that worries Hankins. What if all the tenants don't finish the coursework? Among a host of legalities and fine print to complete, the board is also seeking a tax exemption for the property, which is critical to keeping the apartments affordable. Barring any problems, current tenants will have the option to purchase their apartments for $2,500 apiece, a discount afforded to them as with the original shareholders who did the work to convert the property. City guidelines will determine the prices for the 7 vacant units, which will be sold through an income-restricted housing lottery operated by the city. A comparable unit in the Morrisania neighborhood in the Bronx was recently listed for $72,000. On a blustery March afternoon, the tenants gathered at the building to celebrate. Josh Flores, 41, a nurse practitioner who's lived in the building for more of a decade, asked other tenants to inspect his black t-shirt. He said, "Is it too much?" he asked, running his hands along the red block lettering that read, "Join the fight for housing rights." Later, Hankins led chants with a bullhorn. "We will win," he shouted, "because we already won." So there you have it. There is the story in a nutshell. It's kind of an interesting one. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot to unpack, and it's a fairly lengthy article. So I don't want to spend too awful much time rehashing it, but there are a couple of things that I do want to mention here. First off, yes, this is obviously possible. We're watching it play out before our very eyes. From the article, it appears that this was kind of a perfect storm of conditions between the landlord's position in the building, changes in the legal landscape, the pandemic, and most importantly, the tenants' ability to get together as a group and make it happen. The landlord purchased this building for $4 million and sold it for $2.6 million. I'm sure he's not thrilled at taking a $1.4 million hit on this transaction, but there have been a lot of changes to the landlord-tenant law here in New York since 2019 and as a result of the pandemic, which had a major, major impact on his ability to operate this building without being at a loss. I don't think that this guy was ever at a profitable point in this building by the sounds of things. I don't know what his due diligence was on the front end of the deal. Maybe he didn't really do it on the front end, and that's why he got stuck in this situation. But honestly, I think that there was a big part of it that was the changes in the legislative landscape, followed by the courts being shut down during the pandemic and things of that nature. All of that combined with unpaid rents and other issues, this may have been the best possible move for this property owner by the time he got to the end of the line here. And on the tenant side, they were able to see the situation, find the resources to help represent them, find the funds to acquire the building, and get the deal done. Obviously, they're still working through the situation here, trying to get this deal done, but I have a feeling that this one will wind up closing. My main concern here is that once the tenants have ownership of the building, will they be able to handle the debt load of the building, as well as all of the maintenance and upkeep and things that come along with that? The nice thing is that it looks like they're working with some groups to help them on the financial side, both in terms of actual dollars and in terms of knowledge, how to run a building, how to manage the building, how to deal with the repairs and upkeep, things of that nature. In addition, they do have a good mix of tenants in the building, so that may help with the upkeep as well. The flip side is that old buildings are super expensive to maintain, and code requirements can often drive up the cost of a project. For instance, if this is a building that has one centralized heat unit, and this heat unit goes out, you're now talking about a special assessment on every unit in that building to try to put a new heater in. And will the tenants be able to come up with the funds to do that? Ultimately, I hope this group of tenants is successful. It's a bad situation for the property owner, at least as it's written, though obviously we don't know anything about if he took his losses and offset something else or whatever the case may be. It's a good situation for the tenants potentially, assuming they're able to keep up with the building. And it's good for the community as a whole. And I know some people will probably disagree when I say that. But it's good for the community as a whole because when people take ownership of their lives, it helps the community as a whole. What do you think on this one? Did the landlord get screwed? Did the tenants, are the tenants going to pull this off? Let us know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.